This is Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another fantastic episode of Lead Balloons Podcast, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. I'm here tonight with Joel Triska. Joel, how you doing?
I'm good, buddy.
Tell you what, that beard and that hairdo is looking better than ever.
Man, I tried to bring top notch for you, Trent, you know.
I really appreciate it. Really appreciate that. Well, tonight, what we're going to do tonight, so when we first started the podcast, like our second episode was Pastoral, the Life of a Resident Philosopher, and it was a chance to kind of talk to Joel about his experiences in the church, and in particular that phase where he transitioned away from pastoral ministry and what that entailed, you know, psychologically and logistically and these kinds of things. And so we're not going to retread that ground really tonight, but what I want to do is I want to give everyone, as well as myself, a deeper look at Joel's particular experience as a pastor, and also sort of a general look at what pastoral ministry is like, sort of in contrast to the work that other people do, as well as we'll talk some about Joel, some of the big experiences that he had, some of the transformative experiences that he had. So you'll get a sense by the end of this of a greater sense of who Joel is as a person, kind of give you an inside look. And at the same time, you're going to get a chance to see what it is and what it was like to be a pastor. So I think this is going to be fun for me. It's going to be fun for everyone listening as we get a chance to kind of dig deeper into the gem that is my good buddy Joel Triska. So with that being said, I want to do a real quick introduction of Joel, and so you know some basics about him, and then we're going to dig into it. But Joel was born and raised in Broken Arrow, Oklahoma, the Buckle, the Bible Belt, essentially God's country.
Dead center, yeah.
Yeah, he went to Oral Roberts University where we met, where he got a Bachelor of Arts in Theology with an emphasis in New Testament. He also was active in doing mission trips. He went to the Philippines as well. He ended up studying there years later as part of his theological training. He went to the Assemblies of God Theological Seminary to get his master's degree, his Master of Divinity, that's in Springfield, Missouri. And then Joel has worked as a pastor in Oklahoma as well as Texas, in a suburban setting as well as an urban setting. We'll get into that more too. Joel's worked as a teacher, a teacher of theology and biblical studies. And then beyond pastoral ministry, Joel has worked in the nonprofit and corporate world. He has, again, like I said, just a wonderful beard repertoire. Joel is a great golfer. Joel enjoys travel. Joel is a lover of whiskey. And he is just a generally fantastic conversationalist and well-read, intriguing, layered, adventurous kind of guy. And so that's Joel in a very sort of Reader's Digest kind of way. Joel, yes. I was really intrigued early on. I wouldn't say early on because I'd known you reasonably well, but I got a chance one time, not too long after college, I think, to go to your office where you were working as a youth minister.
Yes.
And you kind of showed off some of your skills.
I was probably showing off, like, look at all this stuff that I am responsible for. I can't believe they let me do all of these things for $22,000 a year.
You were raking it in, man. I mean,
man,
I didn't know
what to do with all that money.
You were a righteous gemstone, you know, just raking it in.
Basically.
And so it was fantastic. But I really was amused when you told me that you were opening up one of your youth services with that song. Tell me what the name of the song was and what some of the lyrics were. I think it's called
Follow Me or Follow by Uncle Cracker.
Yeah. Follow me and everything is all right. I'll be the one who takes you home at night. And if you want a man, I can guarantee you won't find nobody else like me.
Listen, guys, I just heard the follow
song.
Me. The follow me comes from the Bible. Everything else, I just expected them not to look too deeply into.
If a person says follow me in whatever context, that person is a Christian.
Listen,
Because they're
so
thinking about Jesus.
they are probably, that context. That's interesting that I shared that with you. That those were evangelical nights. You grew up in the tradition I grew up in. We were evangelism times a billion. We're just constantly trying to save the lost. And so we would do these big youth outreach nights, and we'd give away a lot of pizza, or we'd give away tacos, or we'd give away whatever. We'd give prizes to kids that invited the most friends. We would have, our youth group, I think, was around 150, 200. But these nights were usually like 500 to 700 kids, teenagers.
Jeez.
And we'd rent out a venue and we'd do this big, huge production.
Damn.
I was not a great singer. I led the worship team. I was not a great singer, but I also had a great band. And so I have played so many weird secular songs. I say secular meaning non-Christian, non-Jesus-y songs. I've done Creed's Higher, which, I basically lost my voice trying to sing that song. Same with Lifehouse's Everything. You're all I want, all I need. I mean, it was just like, why am I singing these songs? I did Semisonic's Closing Time. We had to change some of the lyrics on that one. And then I did All Star by Smash Mouth. And I don't, what was I doing? I don't know. If going back, if any of those were taped and put on YouTube now, I would be humiliated. It's so cringy. But such is what it's like to be Joel Triska.
I mean, a trendsetter, an edgy, willing to take the big swings was Joel Triska.
That's right. The
sort
Babe Ruth.
The Norm,
pastors.
and sort of the risk take, sort of the Norm Macdonald of the theological world. Just out there.
Another apropos comparison.
Double middle fingers to the establishment kind of a guy. Now I would be, before we get a little too deep into this, I would be remiss if I didn't ask a question that's on a lot of people's minds tonight. And that is, please remind us that it is true, right, that you can't be a Christian and vote Democratic, right? Just because I know a lot of people are thinking that.
Yeah, that's what I was taught, basically. And that there's really only one thing that matters, and that's abortion. And anyone that questions that clearly is either possessed, or maybe they were sent by God to test our faith.
Right. Okay. Just clearing that up, because I think some people out there a lot of people be thinking about that. Woo! With that out of the way, now we can really go forward into it. Just got that settled. So, okay. So, Joel, talk to us about this. Tell us more about how pastoral ministry as a job compares to other types of jobs. What are similarities and differences?
So, quick qualifier, it's going to depend on, first of all, the church. Most of them have the same amount, the same job descriptions, but there's certain things that you just do in different volume settings. It's kind of like that equalizer, some are heavier on the bass, some are heavier on the treble. If you get into more rural environments, that's going to be very heavy in just pastoral visits. You're talking a lot of usually older congregations. You're doing a lot of family visits, hospitals, funerals, all of those sorts of things. You're doing a little bit more of that, where you get in the suburban kind of these mega church models. These operate more like CEOs, and they have pastoral staffs that take care of those kinds of things, where these guys are, and I say guys because it's 95% men. They're up there being the visionary, and they're leading the board, and they're doing fundraising, a lot of that kind of stuff. All of those things are done by all pastors, but they're done in different volume settings, depending on your context. I would say for me, I was at a small church in an urban environment that was very young. So when I was youth pastor, I was doing hospital visits all the time, every week. We had, I think, 9 staff pastors, and they broke it up to where everyone would take, if someone was getting a surgery, or they were in the hospital for the first day at a church of over 1,500 people. I had, every Thursday I was at hospitals all day. And so when I moved to Dallas, in this urban neighborhood called Deep Ellum, it was a younger congregation. I didn't go to the hospitals unless something went really, really wrong. And it was usually not always wrong. Sometimes it was a birth. There was a lot of babies being born. So I was in hospitals a lot for that. But it was usually someone's dying or someone's very sick, very ill. And that didn't happen as often with the younger congregation. I did a ton of weddings. I officiated a ton of weddings. I did not lead that many funerals. And when I did lead funerals, it was never because someone died of natural causes or died in their 80s. They were funerals for children, funerals for middle-aged people that got diagnosed with cancer and passed quickly. So those are the kind of situations that I was in. And so in some ways, I would say there's similarities to just all work. Like I had a work week, I had work hours. What's different is I didn't have weekends. Like a lot of events happen on the weekend, Sunday, obviously. So my day off was a weekday. I would say also most pastors don't have, they may try, and I certainly did try to keep, hours that I work in, but work bleeds into all parts of your life. Constantly meeting with people, family, going over to their house, hosting people at our house. Because I was at a smaller church that was more of a startup, we did the small groups. We hosted one of the small groups that met in our house for years, for probably like a decade. And it was just like there was a lot of evening. Most people aren't working in their evening. What they're doing is they're working and going to church in their off hours, which meant I had to work when everyone else was working. And then I had to work when people weren't working. So that was kind of the life of a pastor. It's very, very hard to create meaningful boundaries and hold those when the community needs access to these faith leaders that they have for just real life situations. And so it created some flexibility, meaning that I during the week I didn't feel bad if I left early. I didn't feel, I definitely would try and compensate in different ways. And then ultimately, like in the end, when you're kind of talking about the differences, fundraising is a big, huge component of being a pastor. You have to talk about money because our income comes from people's generosity. Now, this isn't always the model of church giving. In the past, I think early 1800s, churches would charge for pew rental. Like I think there's a record of Abraham Lincoln having back, he had missed some of his pew rentals at the local church in DC. Even today, synagogues, they do church membership that are like fees. And so, but most Christian churches rely on the giving of the congregation. And, some older denominations like Catholicism and these larger, more kind of more established denominations, they compensate and kind of help the churches and fund them. But these younger ones, most evangelical churches, they rely completely 100% on people giving. That's why there's a heavy emphasis on what's called tithing. They want people to give 10% of their income, and they wrongly quote a bunch of passages from the Old Testament to justify it. The New Testament does not talk about tithing in that way, but pastors tend to skate over that because it sabotages their efforts to guilt people into giving 10% of their income, which is some people do that, and that's great, and I think it's cool, but it's just like it's not biblical.
If you are a salesman and you don't hit your quotas, you can be terminated. If you are a construction worker and the house you're working on collapses, you could lose your job. What are the deliverables by which you're held accountable and could potentially not be employed as a pastor anymore? What are those things for pastors? What sort of are the biggies? Like obviously you when you worked as a pastor, you probably had the things that were top of mind for you that you measured yourself by and the things that you wanted to be known for, but those may not have been the same as what the board of elders, the church leadership wanted from you. What were some of the big deliverables that you were held to?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. First, it's going to depend on, there's multiple styles of church government. So some traditions like Methodists, they will place pastors at certain church for a year or two and then move them and bring in another pastor.
Okay.
So in those cases, there's less like pressure on them to deliver certain things, and the congregation's just used to getting a new pastor every 2 years or so. Our model was what's called congregational, which is a lot of the evangelical churches, which means the congregation votes in a pastor. The pastor is accountable to the board of directors, board of elders, whatever they might call them. And the deliverables could, switch from church to church, but the main thing is just like, do people like you?
Yeah.
And if they like you, if you're effective, that means you're raising funds, you're casting vision, you're showing up for people. You can usually see it in the congregation's attendance. Like if a pastor comes in and the church shrinks to half its size within a year, that's
a
red
problem.
flag. Yeah, that's a red flag. And so often things are done, but again, these churches, it's a weird place. It's a Wild West, man.
Yeah.
Some of the world's most gifted narcissists and manipulators are pastors, and they load the board with people that they know are in their back pocket that they can manipulate, and they may destroy a church overnight, but the church now has no power to get rid of them because the board is the one that would do that. There's usually a voting structure on that.
Sure. Interesting. Tell us about sort of your daily and weekly habits. People have rituals that help them to accomplish things and things that they do on a daily basis. What were some of the daily and weekly habits and disciplines that you needed to be effective at your work as a pastor?
I mean, you have to have like tons of soft skills is what's, the corporate world would talk about, which is like relational skills. Can you present to people? Can you communicate effectively? Can you empathize and really be with people so they feel seen and heard? These sorts of skills are so important. Now, the bigger the organization gets, let's say these mega churches that are running 5,000 plus, these pastors aren't out in the trenches as much. They are behind, closed walls and with their board and their mahogany desks. So they might not have as much of soft skills. They are kind of like the Steve Jobs kind of wannabes who don't have a great, if you get to know them personally, they're actually kind of assholes, but they can hide all of that when they're up on the stage with the bright lights and telling stories about how much they care about people. And so for me, though, I loved meeting with people one-on-one, and I needed skills to be able to empathize, to be able to listen, to be able to actively listen, to be able to offer comfort and those sorts of things. I had to be very comfortable with uncomfortable situations. It might be people early on when I was a pastor, within the first year of being a lead pastor, I started getting overwhelmed by all the suffering in our community. And by that, I just mean I knew a lot of things that people told no one else. I like the number of times I've heard someone start out a sentence or start out a share with, "I've never told anyone this before," is in the thousands. I've heard that so many times. And it's, it's kind of like a occupational hazard. People just kind of like, they assume you're in this role, and it's kind of like the bartender, hears a lot of stuff too.
What?
Me and the bartender hear a lot of things. And, I would just be thinking about it at the time. That first year, we had less than 100 people in our community, but I was just like, I knew which marriages were struggling and on the verge of divorce. I knew who was struggling with their sexual identity. I knew who was whose estranged mother or father was dying of cancer. It's like all these people are dealing with real life shit. And I'm meeting with them, I'm hearing them, and it's just like I didn't know how to take it on, to not take it on and feel it with them. And it took me some time to develop some some strategies that kind of
Hmm.
protected myself from fully getting into the weeds of everyone's problems. Still be there, but not go home feeling just completely depleted and depressed. And so that took me a little bit. A lot of people in the helping professions have to do that. Counselors, therapists, social workers. We all have to figure out how to like to quarantine our mental sanity from all the awful things that people are struggling with that they tell us about. That was
Hmm.
another thing. And I'll say too,
Yeah. Yeah.
study and writing, like that's something
Hmm.
that I really enjoyed. I've always been enjoyed kind of like education. So studying and writing for sermons,
Yeah.
studying and writing for classes that I would teach. We didn't do traditional Sunday school, but I would do workshops and things like that. So
Hmm.
one of my favorite ones that I put together is I did church history in 90 minutes. And so we talked about
Hmm.
all of church history up to modern day times in 90
Hmm.
minutes. And that was a fun
Hmm.
presentation that I would do
Wow.
every year.
Fascinating. Well, you've highlighted, I think, two aspects of pastoral ministry that are interesting in juxtaposition. That is the part of pastoral ministry that's very others focused, requires probably a good bit of extroversion, or at least you have to fake it if you don't have it. And then the other half, or the other side of it, that occupies quite a bit of time each week is sermon preparation.
Yeah.
And can be a very lonely, solitary thing. Maybe it need not be, but maybe some of it really, it does require you to just open up your books and dive in and research and write and mull over things and meditate. And then actually, the
Mm-hmm.
small act of delivering the sermon might take a half hour to an hour, depending on what church
Mm-hmm.
you're in. But when I was interning as a pastor, um, I had an opportunity to preach a number of sermons. And I think that I did get better. I think of myself as a good speaker, but I think of myself as a good speaker, particularly in the context of teaching. When I'm in a classroom, I have a chance to sort of feed off of the energy in the room, answer questions, move my lecture sort of in the direction I sense it needs to go. Preaching was very, very difficult for me. Again, I think I got better. I think I was okay, but I was never quite sure what I was trying to do. And I don't know if I had enough practice to really come into my own. I I was like, what am I supposed to be teaching here? Am I supposed to be persuading people, getting them riled up, making them fearful for their salvation, whatever it
Yeah.
was? Talk to us about what is a sermon, what could and should it do? And let's see the other part of this question that I had here. Yeah, like it's a sermon can persuade, it can inform. In some traditions, like preaching the word is sort of like doing the text. It's sort of like
Mm-hmm.
enacting the word of God, sort of in the here and now. What is your view of what a sermon is, what it should and could be,
Mm-hmm. Great
and you
question.
and how you personally approached the preparing of a sermon?
So I went through a lot of the same classes you went through. For everyone out there who's not heard of the term homiletics, it's the study of preaching sermons, which is a bit of a dying art form, honestly. It's and not for bad reasons. I think it's a dying art form because it
Hmm.
doesn't connect as much with our culture.
Hmm.
These kinds of speaking engagements. I mean, how many places other than occasional concerts do people to get together and sing with hundreds of people? Uh,
Right.
like like these kinds of activities are becoming
Hmm.
less and less, and I think it's a really powerful thing to sit and listen to a message together with a community that you trust. Um, I learned early on a lot of techniques, right? You're given all these different techniques on how to public speak. Here's how you outline your
Hmm.
sermon, or here's how you manuscript your sermon. There's exegetical, expositional, thematic, narratival. There's all these different
Right.
different kinds of ways of doing it. And I dabbled with all of that, but eventually I just let it all go because I've always kind of had skills around communication. And I felt like most of what I was learning in these classes were for people who didn't have the skills yet. And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
just decided to say, poo poo with all of that. I'm just going to do this the way I want to do this. I enjoy, I used to, like you said, I taught theology classes. I taught intro to New Testament, intro to Old Testament, and I taught intro to theology, which was like a systematics course. And so I had someone early on tell me that, Joel, there's two things you can do. There's the teacher and there's the communicator. And this is someone who clearly had their own bias. And he said the teacher takes simple things and makes them complex. A communicator takes complex things and makes them simple. So always be a communicator. And I was just like, okay. And I was, I think, 19 when I heard someone say that to me. And it didn't take me long to say, what a false dichotomy. That is just not true.
Yes.
And I like to ride that line between teacher and communicator. I like to get into nerdy stuff, to talk about the why, to explain like the history of or the etymology of things. And then I also like to tell stories. I liked, to me, I wanted, when I was a professor, I was a professor who told a lot of stories. And when I was a pastor, I was a communicator who also got into the teaching aspects of things. I would use this little, on my iPad, I would preach from my iPad, where I would have the PDF of my manuscripted sermon. I always manuscripted them because I cared very deeply about the phraseology. And so if there was a part that I really wanted to get right, I wanted to make sure I had it there in front of me. And I would sometimes use a digital whiteboard that would go up on the screens, and I draw a Greek word or a Hebrew word, and or I do some like diagramming around that. But I also had deep convictions about when I would outline my sermon. I had this big, huge whiteboard in my office, and I would create an outline before I manuscripted it. I would do little symbols by where am I telling us? Where am I telling a story that's going to make people feel like I want to make people laugh. I want to make people chuckle. I want to make people like feel like deep emotion. Sometimes they might be crying. And I would do little symbols along my outline, making sure that I'm keeping people emotionally engaged along with being intellectually engaged. And I would intentionally, these are all just like speaking tricks with large groups, but I'd always make sure to always break it up with something. Like I'd break it up with the whiteboard or something like that, or I'd get people talking to their neighbor. All right, here's a question, ask your neighbor about this. Or I do like a text poll, ask a question, everyone has to pull out their phone and answer a question, kind of thing. So these are the kinds of things that I would do. To me, I was inspired by three different things. I listened to a lot of sermons from good communicators, and that helped me find the things that resonated with me. It's kind of like good writers are great readers. Have you ever heard that phrase?
Yes.
I heard Stephen King say that one time. Good writers are great readers. So I listened to a lot of speaking, but not just sermons. What I really found my inspiration in was comic stand-up comedy. And so their ability to say things with just the right phraseology, or to say something that people are laughing, but they're laughing about something that might be really true and challenging. A good comedian will do that. And then I would also make sure that I was being inspired by reading other books that just that challenged me. I wanted people to not only feel and laugh and learn, but I wanted people to feel challenged. And this was a real subtle thing. You can't overdo it. If you go out there just like fire and brimstone, or if you come out there just like telling people that they're stupid for believing X, Y, and Z, I mean, none of that's going to land. To use a biblical reference, those seeds are gonna fall on the hard soil, right? They're not They're not gonna be effective. And my job wasn't egotistical. My job wasn't to go out there and feel good about what I did. My job was to go out there and do something that actually landed and hopefully helped improve people's sense of being and their journeys. So that was for me. I always wanted to bring subtle challenges. Usually I would bring up a traditional view that everyone believed, like the phrase born again. And I remember preaching on this out of the book of John, and how that's a mistranslation. It's really born from above is what the translation ought to be. But King James, there's a whole history, and I go into all of that and say it's pretty uncomfortable that we use a phrase that's not true. And so then just kind of like get people looking differently at their own faith. And what does that mean? I think it's when you get people off balance and you create appropriate confusion, that makes them very open to okay, well, what is out there? What more is there to learn? Because in order to learn more, people have to let go of what they think they already know. And so that was one of the tactics I would regularly use.
Well, Jules, I'm listening to you. It's making me a little bit sad that I didn't have the chance to sit under your pastoral ministry for a lot of years, buddy, because and hopefully people told you this enough, but I think you must have been one of the very, very rare pastors, because you really check a lot of boxes. I mean, you are highly academically qualified without being pretentious. You are super approachable. I think you prepare and you communicate in such a way that it's clear that you care about what you're saying, and you care about people, and you want to meet people where they're at. But again, you don't dumb it down. You just strive to make it approachable, and you do so with sort of this relentless creativity and concern about making the message listenable to. And I think that's fantastic. If we had a world full of pastors like you, I'm 100% sure that it would be a better place.
Oh,
And
thanks, buddy.
yeah, but I was just thinking that I think when people the dichotomy of complex simple and simple complex, really what it is, there are moments in life when it's important to take the convoluted or the complex and make it simple. But there are also times when it's important to take what people have mistakenly perceived as simple and to complicate it. That's something
I
that
love
you and
it.
I do
Yeah.
in this podcast. Like, if somebody comes out and says, well, I'll tell you how the universe came into being. It just God snapped his fingers and there it was. It's like, that's a moment when somebody has simplified something that is infinitely complex.
Yes.
That's a moment where the simple approach will not do.
God said
So
it.
I
I
think
believe it. That settles it.
exactly. So the art is knowing where and when to make things simple and complicated.
Yeah.
Um,
Agreed. One of
so
the arcs that I felt like I would do is I would problematize passages that people are
yes,
familiar with. And then, but I
yes,
would bring it back to a place of going like, just because it's problematized doesn't mean you can't believe exactly what you believed before I problematized it. What's
sure,
changed now is you are making a decision about a complex situation, and you're choosing to make that decision that you need to be responsible for, versus someone telling you this
yes,
is what it means and you don't have to decide because this is what it means. I was constantly trying to psychologically empower people to be responsible for what they believe.
that's right.
And most people
Yes,
aren't. They're not responsible for what they believe. They just kind of like,
Hmm.
I mean, I remember there were people that we tended to attract a lot of like educated people who had, master's degrees at and doctorates from Ivy League schools. We had a lot of people. We had a lot of attorneys apparently in our congregation. I don't know why we attracted so many of people from that ilk, but what I found in those situations was people were finding that what they wanted from their faith community was what they experienced in their education, which was exposure to new ideas, the permission to be creative, to question, to think critically. And a lot of churches don't offer that. It's not a
Not
safe
even
place to do that.
close.
Yeah.
Not even close. Well, this leads quite nicely to the next thing I wanted to talk to you about, and that is how much truth can a congregation handle? Like, for instance, when I was in seminary, it became quite clear to me that there were things that I was learning that were fascinating and upsetting even at times, but that other pastors that I knew who had similar seminary training were not sharing these discoveries with their congregation. Now, I
No.
don't know if that's right or wrong, but it kind of rubbed me the wrong way. Now, you can't share everything. Well, today, folks, congregation, we learned about the deponent, middle deponent, conjugations or whatever it was in Greek. Like, people don't really
They
need
don't
to
care.
hear
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
don't care. But there were other things like learning that I didn't know all these years until I was towards the end of my seminary studies. So, like, for instance, there were very similar creation narratives and flood narratives in the ancient Near East That's kind of important to know. That's
Yeah.
really important. That's that's what we might call a newsworthy event. And
Yeah.
pastors weren't sharing these. So I put some of it on the pastors, but I asked you the question, how much truth can a congregation handle? How much do they want? And maybe even along those lines, you might share the story of, a well-educated parishioner who just kind of wants you to give him sort of the basic answers and
Hmm.
not confuse him,
Yeah.
so speak to that.
Yeah, I like most things, the answer is it depends on the congregation. Now,
Yeah.
I was able to be a part of a congregation that I helped shape the culture. So over the course of several years, my style of teaching both probably dissuaded some people from attending there and attracted others. And so you began to have kind of a sort of, we tended to have a congregation that was heavy in the creative spaces, a lot of architects, a lot of graphic
Mm.
designers, a lot of interior designers, and also heavy
Hmm.
in kind of the professionals. We had a lot of people that were in politics and law and things of that nature. It was interesting, and I think when you
Mm.
cultivate a culture like that, you have more. I over time I pushed a lot of boundaries for myself. But is because I knew that I had already gained the trust of a congregation. I had like
Yeah.
a personal brand that, you know,
Mm.
when Joel speaks, you're likely going to hear a poop joke and a Harry Potter reference. Yeah, so it's just like that was kind of I was
Yeah. Yeah.
constantly I was constantly trying to not take myself too seriously in front of people, but also slip in some knowledge,
Mm.
some Greek and Hebrew or some church history that would make them go, "Whoa! I never heard that." It's like, did you know that Isaiah was likely written by two different individuals? Most even evangelical scholars believe in Deutero Isaiah, and I was constantly challenging the view of
Mm.
inerrancy. I
Hmm.
feel like I was constantly trying to get these people, though I love the Bible, they worshipped it. And most of these people came from Bible Baptisty backgrounds. They were Father, Son, Holy Bible kinds of folk.
Yeah.
And I was constantly trying to get them to stop worshiping the Bible because it led to a lot of like bad conclusions and bad views, bad beliefs. And there
Right.
was one
Right.
guy who he had he was an attorney, very successful attorney in Dallas. And when he first started attending, he wasn't a Christian, and he was there when I had just started in
Yeah.
2009, and I was speaking on the Book of Genesis, going back to some of those creation narratives and things like that. And I would always throw in those little nuances. Always,
Mm-hmm.
it would put people a little bit off balance, and I feel like when people are off balance a little bit, you got them. Yeah, like that's the best thing you can do as a speaker is get people a little like build some trust, some rapport, and then with not by lying, but with truth, throw them a little off balance. And he called my sermons lectures. He said, "I really am enjoying your lectures," because he had never gone to church before, so he didn't know what
Right.
else to
Right.
call
Right.
them. Um,
Yeah.
Years later, he became a board member. Everything he got, he was baptized. I got to baptize him. Super nice guy, brilliant. Um, but he had also gone very deep into like more conservative views of Christianity because of the woman he
Sure.
married and her family. And while he was on the board was when we this would have been like, I came in, I started in 2009. This would have been probably 2017, 2018 when we transitioned our community being fully inclusive of our LGBTQ members. We had always had members that were, self-identifying LGBTQ, but we had never come out explicitly to say, hey, if you're LGBTQ, if that's how you self-identify, you can be a member, you can be a board member, you can serve with the kids in the back, all of that kind of stuff. And
Yep.
he didn't like that. He disagreed with that. And at some point he looked me in the eyes and said, "Joel, I came to realize that I can't talk about this with you because you know way more about this than me." Um, that didn't stop him from believing what he believed. That didn't stop him from just like, ultimately he was like, "I trust you to lead me in areas of spirituality except where I don't want you to." And
That is
that's kind of what he was saying.
It's just not, and maybe other people would hold me guilty in this regard, where I think I'm innocent, which is I just can't relate to that, man. It's just such a
Yeah.
weird thing. Can you imagine going to like a structural engineer and you're like, listen, that bridge that I believe and I know that it's safe to go across that bridge, and the structural engineer's like, no, we've shut down the bridge. We clearly we've analyzed the
And they're like,
bridge. We can
wait, but I
see that
read a Wikipedia article that said it's safe, so we're
said it's
good.
safe, said, or maybe even didn't read anything at all. They just know that that's what they want to believe. It's like, but I know things. I've
Hmm.
studied them. I can show you even some of what I know. I can give you citations and talk to you about
Hmm.
structural density and the forces and run the
Hmm.
equations, all these kinds of things. That the person's like, no, I'm going to believe the thing that makes me feel good. It's like, so you're not interested in responding to knowledge and growing.
Hmm.
It's such a foreign thing to me. It's one
Yeah.
thing if you say, I want to know more about that. I think I'm still going to believe this thing, but I really want to know more. But to be like, I'm not interested in learning more. I know you know a ton of stuff, but I'm going to believe what I'm going to believe. God, it's such a small way of living. I can't relate to it, but some
Yeah.
people enjoy that, I guess. Um,
And I'll
whatever,
be and I'll be fair. There are smart people who have my degree and some even more who are very committed to these traditional views. Now, I'm going to
Sure.
argue that most of those people have to maintain those traditional views if they want to keep a job.
That's right. Yeah.
There are so many evangelical scholars who have evolved in their thinking
Mm,
and get ostracized by the Christian
right.
community.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
I mean, I could name several of them. No one will have heard them because they're writing books that you only buy as textbooks in graduate school. But a lot of these if you're committed to studying to find the truth versus studying to more sophisticatedly defend the dogma you believe your denomination believes, those are two different worlds, and it's pretty easy to tell which lane you're in,
Yeah.
by
Yeah.
listening to the person's defense of their beliefs.
Well, if I can geek out for just a second here on this topic, I was in seminary. This was probably 2005, 2006, and I came across a book. I think I bought the book. I don't think I have it anymore, but I was quite impressed. I think it was written by an evangelical scholar named I. Howard Marshall, if you
Oh yeah,
remember that
I
character
love
at
I.
all.
Howard
But
Marshall. Yeah,
it was a great book about basically he was trying to talk
Beyond
about
the
the
Bible, was
problem
that
with
it?
beyond the Bible. That's
Yeah,
right.
it's a great
He
book.
was looking at it and thinking, how is it that we have all these evangelical scholars who have the roughly the same set of hermeneutical exegetical tools, looking at the same text, coming up with quite different
Very different.
interpretations of
Yep.
those things. How do we explain that, and how do we come up with an interpretive grid that can contend with those different? I thought it was a very, I don't know, it might be too much to say brave book, but I thought it was very important and very um, impressive to see that from somebody, because you don't get a lot of that. You
I
don't get a
have
lot of
that book on my
honesty.
bookshelf. It's a short read. It's one of those kind of books that for people who aren't in academia, it's really fun because usually the author will write kind of an essay of sorts, and there's usually a couple other scholars who will
Yes.
rebut the essay for different reasons, and then the author will respond to their rebuttals. And it was a fun book to read, to kind of like watch
Mm,
people debate their reasons. And I remember him giving, if I'm getting this rightly, he talks about how for everyone out there, biblical scholarship is not a monolith. There's
hmm
a lot of different biblical scholars that believe a lot of different things. So to say, "Oh, you studied the Bible, you must know the truth," is like you can get 50 people who've studied the Bible in a room and get them to talk about like the atonement or exclusivity of Christ, or pick some doctrine. I don't know. And
Right.
you're going to get so many different opinions. And that's good. You should. But there's a tradition in scholarship, biblical scholarship, that would be called exegeticals, like exegetes that are really into diving deep into a passage and really pulling out the nuances of a Greek verse, a verse in the Greek. And then you have the systematics who are looking at the Bible more like thematically. And the way that works geographically, a lot of exegetical scholars have come from the UK, which is where I.H. Marshall
Mm-hmm.
came from. And a lot of the systematicians that are more liberal in their interpretations come from Europe,
Mm-hmm.
specifically Western Europe and the school of Tübingen, where a lot of that began. And so what I.H. Marshall was arguing is like the channel that dug
Right,
to
right,
connect
yes.
the UK to Europe. It's like we got to dig towards each other and find that common ground. And that's what he was really arguing. And evangelical scholars freaked out about it. They
Oh yeah,
freaked out.
yeah.
This was later on in his life, and you're right, it was a brave book because it cost him a lot of the reputation he had built as one of the world's best New Testament scholars. It cost him a lot of fanfare.
Well, let me join I. Howard Marshall, at least maybe in the sentiment he might have had in saying "fuck them." Fuck them, dude.
Yeah.
If you can't be intellectually honest, and if you're just gonna pussyfoot around and you're gonna punish people for trying to be intellectually honest, you are a small person. I have
Mhm.
so little respect for people who believe the same thing at age 18 that they do at 55,
I
70,
know.
whatever it is. Like, grow a little bit and have
Hmm.
some courage at some point. I don't know. Anyway, well, this
I
this
love it
leads
when
me to
you
ask
get
the question.
grumpy.
What were one or two pretty Robert Frostian two roads diverged in a wood. I took the one less traveled by. What were a
Hmm.
couple moments in your pastoral ministry that were defining moments of transition or evolution for you?
One was disaffiliating with a denomination I grew up with. So the church that we took over was affiliated with the Assemblies of God. I held my credentials with them for a while, um, for a couple years after that. But the truth was, I was doing that primarily for the network and for these were my family, this was my friends. And no, I
Yeah,
didn't believe
yeah,
almost any of. I mean, they have some very fundamentalist doctrines that they still hold on to. The Assemblies of God was born in the 20s and 30s, and so they hold on to a lot of that's when fundamentalism began. So this is the premillennial reign of Christ, the inerrancy of Scripture. There's all kinds of like the rapture and all of these kinds
yeah.
of doctrines that seminary taught me weren't true. Like I learned that those weren't true in an Assemblies of God seminary. Now, the professors wouldn't say that out loud because this was a denominational seminary, but they gave us enough information for those who were actively seeking the truth to go like, I see what we're talking about here. I see that this is an older view that is well, it makes sense that it was born of a time, um, the interpretive grid of the 20s and 30s, but it's not the kind of scholarship that would stand up to scrutiny. And so that was big, disaffiliating from my denomination because it meant that I was cutting ties in a sense with my past, with the network, the friends and families and mentors, um, and I was embarking on my own journey. And so that was a really big moment when I did that. Another one was in our faith community, we really struggled with finances. We were not a very large congregation, and so we had to find creative ways to get income. And one of
Hmm.
our mission, part of our mission was to be integrated into the neighborhood. So we had a coffee shop, we had an art gallery, we had a co-working space, and we did all these things. And what we found that there was an opportunity to use our building for events, live events. And so we became an event center as well. And we had someone on our staff that was very gifted at doing events. And that's how we supplement our income for several years before,
Hmm.
while our
Hmm.
congregation was still kind of growing. And
Sure.
it eventually got to a place where the giving did
Hmm.
sustain the organization. But also, like, my ex-wife and I used to pastor there. I think we came on and they paid it, both of us. Both of us have masters of divinity. Both of us have MDivs, and they paid us together, I think, $35,000 a year. And so that's why, I just I had a baby. My daughter was only like a year old, and so that's why I went and started teaching as well, because I needed supplemental income. By the time we left, both of us were making a not quite standard salaries, but we were making a living wages at that time.
Sure.
And it took a while for the congregation to kind of get over this. So leaning into the events, which meant sometimes we were renting out our building for like a Jameson event. There was Jameson,
Sure.
like these liquor companies, they have money, right? And we're like,
Yeah.
and I love what I think I heard it say one time by D.L. Moody. The only thing tainted about money is there taint enough of it. And so that's that. I leaned into that. It's just like, listen, if you're gonna give me money, we would rent our building out for $4,500 a pop for one night, and
Sure.
we'd end up making about $3,000 off of that.
Yeah.
That do one of those a month, and we were able to make payroll. And so finding creative ways to that are outside traditional means of income, and we had to get very creative with that because some of that can like raise a red flag with the IRS and stuff like that. So you had to be very like have all your ducks in a row. I didn't take a class in seminary that helped me be an entrepreneur. I had to figure that stuff out just on my own. And the last one was switching from becoming fully inclusive for our LGBT community. For the first half of my time, I was there for 12 and a half, 13 years. The first 6 years, I was still holding on to traditional views that I had been told about homosexuality, largely because I didn't know how to get around it in the Bible. There was maybe a verse or two that I couldn't get around it. Paul clearly believed this was wrong. Clearly. Romans 1, and he kind of talks about some other areas, but that's Romans 1's the big one for most people.
Sure. Yeah.
And I didn't know how to get it. I remember sitting down with a pastor at a very large, the large Presbyterian church downtown, and we were having lunch, and he had kind of already evolved on that. He was much older than me. He was 10 years older than me, and I really love him. Really, he was kind of a mentor for a while, for a little bit there, and we were having a conversation about it. And I said, like, I was telling him, like, I don't know how to get around this, man. I read gay theologians. I hear their arguments. I hear them talking about David and why am I forgetting?
David and Jonathan.
I almost said Solomon. Yeah. I was like, that's his son. All right, David and Jonathan, talking about them maybe having kind of a relationship. I hear them speculating about different interpretations of verses. I'm just like, at that time I wanted it to be true. I hated that part of the Bible because I just had so many people in our community that were struggling, and I didn't know how to get around it. And I take that very seriously. If I'm going to like follow the truth, I need to follow the truth. And he just kind of smiled at me and said, "Well, you'll get there." And I remember being so angry at him. I was so angry. I was like, "That is such an arrogant thing for him to say." But he was right. He was right, because I kept following love and truth. Eventually, I realized the obstacle was a doctrine of inerrancy that is not biblical. That is one way of looking at the Bible that really hamstrings your ability to love all people. And so I allowed the Bible to be more Jewish in its iteration, and which means that what is written is we're not trying to literally follow it. We're trying to follow the commentaries like the Midrash and the Talmud. We're trying to follow the history and the communal understanding of these sacred scriptures rather than trying to dissect it and turn it into wooden structures that we all have to like live by. And that was a big time. And when that happened for me, I transitioned on that maybe 2 or 3 years before our church transitioned, because our community honestly wasn't ready for it yet. And largely because my ex-wife also wasn't ready for it yet. And so I couldn't go that route if the rest of the staff wasn't on board. And so I just kind of waited. And when there was finally alignment there, I remember just feeling so free to be able to just love people without feeling guilty for it. And so that was a big transition for me.
Interesting. Yeah, I was happy in my life when I was free from the sense of obligation to try to share the gospel with people that were like coworkers and friends and stuff. That used to be like a big burden around my neck. I was like, I gotta share the gospel.
Yep.
Man.
What kind of Christian are you, man? Don't you know? One day they're going to look at you and be like, "Why didn't you tell me?"
As the demons drag him down to hell. Well, let's wrap this up by thinking about the future. Our world is drastically different,
Hmm.
spiritually in so many ways than it was, 50 years ago. And
Yeah.
a lot of churches are closing their doors. I live in Denver. You look at like Colorado Springs, an hour to the south. It's like
Mecca.
evangelical Mecca,
Yep.
and then 60 minutes to the north here in Denver, it's a
Hmm.
very unchurched area, very unchurched area.
Sounds
I'll
awesome.
be honest with you. I feel bit a lot of mixed emotions about church. When I see a church close, I'm tempted to be happy, and that's going to sound horrible. But one of the reasons I'm tempted to be happy is a church is not always a place of healing and encouragement and growth and outreach and all these kinds of things. It's oftentimes a place of judgment and
Hmm.
exclusion and groupthink and the
Hmm.
stagnation of knowledge and obscurantism. And it stands to me for many of the kinds of things, intellectual dishonesty, and there's a lot about these places that I don't like. But so with that in view, Joel, what are the limits and the potential of pastoral ministry in today's world and going forward? And do you still see pastoral ministry as a viable profession?
Hmm. I would say the limits for being a pastor, male, female, LGBTQ, whatever kind of person you are, if you are vocationally clergy, then the limits are the structures of the church. And by the church, I should say that with quotes, that I kind of think about the word church, capital C, the same way I think about orthodoxy. They're not real as a singular entity. There is no such thing as the church anymore. People talk about it. They like to
Mm-hmm,
talk
mm-hmm.
about it,
Right,
but
right.
it's churches. It's denominations. It's multiple perspectives that some are pretty aligned with some distinct differences, but some are like worlds
Mm.
apart. United Church of Christ, which has gay clergy, is very different than the Church of Christ, which won't even play like musical instruments when they're
Right,
doing
right.
worship
Yes,
and
yeah.
won't let women pray out loud. So
Right, right.
like these are very different. The church is like, stop it. What are we doing here? It's an ideology that reality doesn't confirm. And so the limits for pastoring is really, what's the structure? It's kind of like, what are my opportunities at this business? Well, describe the business structure. What's it about? Is it healthy? Is it succeeding? Is it
Mm-hmm.
is it making money? So like when it talks about the church, culture is not a fan of what
Mm-hmm.
what church has been doing in America. And a lot of people will say that America is kind of like 10 years behind Europe.
Mm.
And Europe, churches are historical like museums that people go to visit and take pictures of. They no longer connect with the
Right.
people there. In many ways, people just kind of go like, "What? I mean, I get that it was in our past, but that's not like relevant to any of our lives." And now in America, I feel like there is a resurgence of conservative kind of orthodoxy. Um, but the problem is there's no such thing as orthodoxy either. There's
Right, right.
orthodoxies. There's a bunch of different churches and a bunch of different denominations that all claim to have right beliefs, which is what orthodoxy what
Right.
it means. And so I think what we're dealing with here is a culture that doesn't really know how to like be self-aware of what's actually happening in the church, and what's happening in Christianity, especially in the American context. And so I think the future is going to be disconnected from these larger denominational organizations that have a lot of bureaucracy, that have a lot of like trying to protect a lot of ideologies of their past.
Mm.
Um, the future will be for the rogues, the ones trying to
Yeah.
do innovative ministry, that are really getting their hands dirty, doing, helping people who are poor, helping people who are suffering. That's when the church is at its best, is when it doesn't have traditional power. To me, it's the difference between when church is healthy and when it's not, is the difference between the love of power and the power of love. And so that's where I feel like in America, it's only the power of love that there's movement in. And the problem is the church world is a saturated market. It is super saturated. I meet someone at least once a week who's considering going into the ministry, and there's this romanticism about it it is so illogical and unrealistic that people think that somehow this is going to give my life meaning. And I just want to take these people by the shoulders and say, like, hey, you are never going to be a megachurch pastor. There are 5 million people vying for these 100 jobs, right? It's just like you might as well try and play the lottery. That you'll have just as much luck.
You gotta get into the NBA, be a pro basketball player.
Yeah, exactly. It's just like it's like stop chasing that. It's really cool that you had some powerful experiences in your church or in your youth group or whatever, but that doesn't have to give your life meaning. And then second, what I want to do to help these people understand is like, you can practice your faith doing whatever you want to. You can be stocking groceries at the grocery store and be an maybe more effective pastor with your coworkers than going to a church where no one wants to go anyways.
Right.
I feel like the future of, if I consider myself a Christian mystic. I do not go to church anymore. I occasionally will go here and there, but it's so hard for me to go these days because I don't know how to turn that part of my brain off. But I feel like the future of the Christian faith will have to be something much more grassroots and disconnected from bureaucratic power.
Yeah, I would say a strong dose of humility would probably be quite helpful to that end. So
yes, 100%.
Well, listen, Joel, I want to say I really appreciate you speaking candidly and thoroughly, and really kind of giving us a really good glimpse into that unique world of pastoral ministry. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope everybody out there that you guys have enjoyed listening and learning here. A lot of cool stuff, a lot of interesting topics that we could have gone much deeper into, but fun to tread this ground. So anyway, everybody, you can reach us at Lead Balloons Pod. God, am I getting our own website? Leadballoonspod.com is our website.
There
you can email us at leadballoonspodcast@gmail.com. Our YouTube channels, just find it under Lead Balloons Podcast. And then obviously you can find us on Spotify and iHeartRadio and Apple Podcasts. So look for us there. Connect with us via email. Give us ideas for topics you want us to cover. And please like and subscribe on YouTube as well. Joel, anything else before we close it out tonight?
Yeah, this has been fun. It's kind of like stirred up some of the things I used to be so passionate about that aren't.
Yeah.
Like, I work in corporate America right now, so I don't get to talk about the Bible that explicitly and all this. Like, I have just like dump trucks of knowledge that I'm just like, what do I do with this?
I know. Exactly. You just let it ferment for a while, I guess. All right. Well, everybody, thanks again for joining us for another really life-changing episode of Lead Balloons Podcast, The Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions. Peace.
Peace, y'all.